Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. Is it Dumela? Goedemiddag. Okay, welcome to another South African National Research Chair initiative in partnership with our erstwhile friends and partners here at the Library and Information Center, Dr. Rukaya Bawa and her team. We're always very glad to partner up with them. It's been a while since we've had an event. In fact, the last time we had a book launch on Zimbabwe, and it was a very successful launch, if I may say so myself. So it is my pleasure as the South African National Research Chair in African Diplomacy and Foreign Policy. And I would also like to add that currently I'm acting in the capacity of Director of the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation. You'll hear more about that institute as we go along in the year. It is indeed my pleasure tonight to host, and I would like to think that it's appropriate to call him an old friend, John Matisson. So John, I remember vividly when we first met. It was during those old Center for Policy Studies days there in downtown Doornfontein. And we're of course here to launch John Matisson's book, God, Spies, and Lies, Finding South Africa's Future Through Its Past. By all accounts, it's a riveting read. Just a word or two about John Matisson. John has a long and illustrious career in the broadcasting industry in South Africa. I remember John in particular during the time when he followed and unpacked for us the South African transition as it unfolded from the Codesa days there in Kempton Park. Of course, I want to say tongue-in-cheek that South Africa, we negotiated our transition and settlement in Kempton Park at what's the gambling house's name? It's now a famous gambling house. Say again? Emperor's Palace. So some would say, of course, by opting for Empress Palace to negotiate our transition, we literally gambled with our future. And I suspect we're going to hear a lot about that today. But even before his works in following the transition as a correspondent, John followed South African politics very, very closely. From the days of Oliver Tambo in exile, followed the nationalist leaders, has written for us some fascinating stuff on the apartheid leaders, John Foster, and his outward movement strategies and policies. And who will, of course, forget P.W. Botha's total onslaught days. I must confess, Dave, when I heard the Minister of Intelligence last week giving his budget vote speech in Parliament, some of the language used was very reminiscent and very familiar, and it reminded me of the late 1980s, you know, targeting NGOs, blaming NGOs for attempts to overthrow the regime and stuff. For those of us who had the privilege, I regard it as a privilege, to try and unmask and unpack the apartheid days and those dark days of apartheid, and professors and scholars like John Matisson. I call it a privilege because I think it's important in the days of Fees Must Fall to remind our students that the struggle didn't start in 2015. Protest action didn't start in 2015. There is indeed a long history of protests in South Africa. And of course, we launching this book on God, Spies, and Lies by John Matisson during the 40th anniversary of the Soweto uprisings of June 1976. And I suspect we're going to hear more about that. So from the apartheid leaders up until the travails of the current President Jacob Zuma and his administration John's book goes into it. And I personally am fascinated by the international dimensions. I have to confess and also apologize. I literally ambushed my friend and colleague, Professor David Moore. He was supposed to be the facilitator, and I was supposed to be the discussant, but because I'm a bit under the weather, I ambushed him just before midday today and said, I think there's something wrong with the program. You are the discussant, and I'm the facilitator, and he didn't hesitate to say, let me go and read the book again. Welcome to both of you. We're looking forward. Again, welcome to all of you. Grab something to eat, grab something to drink. Just the house rules. We are here to engage in dialogue, hopefully in rigorous fashion, but we're not here to hurl insults. We're certainly not here to threaten violence and guerrilla warfare, as happened during recent events. There's a time to protest, and then there's a time to engage openly and frankly. Once again, on behalf of the Library and Information Center and the SARCHI Chair, welcome to all of you. And without further ado, join me in welcoming the author of our book tonight, John Matisson. Please join me. John, you can sit, you can stand, it's up to you. Incidentally, we are on live streaming, meaning you are on television. Those of you who want to share the limelight with me, when you want to ask a question later, you're more than welcome to come to the podium and ask your question so that you can also be on television. We know that some of our students and academics at our other campuses, Soweto, Doornfontein, and elsewhere, are joining us in this discussion. So welcome to all of you as well, joining us offshore, but indeed being part of UJ. John, over to you.
Thank you. Can you all hear me? Is it okay if I sit here? Does that work for you? Thanks. Thank you, Chris. Thanks so much for inviting me, and David for coming and to interrogate me. I'm really delighted to be here. You know, I wrote this book in some isolation, although I got a bit of support from the Stellenbosch Institute for Advanced Studies and from FASA, the Academic and Non-Fiction Association, Authors Association of South Africa. But mostly I sat on my own writing. And so, although the book has been very well received, I really haven't, I'm looking forward to much more engagement with people like yourselves. And especially now that the campuses have come alive again, I'm really keen to engage with you and to see how you test, clash with, disagree with, or whatever, with what I've written. I want to explain something else about the book. The book uses as a thread the relationship between journalists and politicians, but it's really as a way to understand South Africa's political history. I'm interested in South Africa's political history. I'm not trying to write a media history, but what I did find is that there were so many things that many of them secrets that I knew that had never been disclosed. And then on the earlier period, things I found that academics who've done research have done some really good stuff on, you know, that the founders of the ANC and so on, and their roles as editors of newspapers and what that meant. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. So for me, the relationship between journalists and politicians between the lines, rather than on the lines. I haven't given you any of my long years of writing for the Rand Daily Mail. All that stuff is now long been used to wrap fish and chips. But I wanted to, but the relationship between the lines, and I'll give you a couple of examples, to me was a good way to understand parts of our history that we have either lost or been, you know, in the simplifying and mythologizing of our history after 1994, you know, certain things were highlighted, certain things were pushed aside. And so I try to give, as far as I'm able, a balance, what I consider my subjective view of what is a balanced assessment of the history. To give you an idea of what I mean when I talk about the relationship between journalists and politicians between the lines and why that can be important. I open chapter 1 with a discussion about Mandela's secret friend. He was a journalist who was a friend of Mandela's and a friend of mine, and I talked to him about Mandela, and I talked to Mandela about him. And what I learned from that was to understand how Mandela strategized. He and his generation, obviously it was never him alone, but in the late 50s and early 60s, how he thought. You know what people talk about Mandela's, people tend to think of Mandela as this kindly old man with a great heart. And he did have a great heart, but I never saw him as a kindly old man. I think his mind was by far for me, the thing that I think we need to engage with more. And his way of assessing everything was to read everything he could on the subject, not as an academic, but as a politician, as a political strategist, keep notes. So he read Marx when he was thinking about civil disobedience. He read Tolstoy and Gandhi when he was going to starting Mkhonto-we-Sizwe. He read von Clausewitz and the other war historians, war strategists, and so on. And so what those two were discussing, which didn't come out at the time at all, none of this was ever discussed in the press, was to try to understand why it was that in the late 50s and early 60s, when apartheid was so strong, it was monolithic. The apartheid establishment seemed monolithic. Although it had enemies around the world, the majority of the country were against it. Why did it stay so powerful? And so what he and this journalist, Charles Bloomberg, were discussing is, what was the essence of its power? And that's where God comes into the title first. Because what they understood, they said that they focused on two things it was resting on. One was ideology and the other was organization. And the ideology was something called Christian nationalism, which they read, this journalist Bloomberg read every single thesis, PhD, by every one of the apartheid theorists. And they all based their thinking on a single Dutch Calvinist theologian named Abraham Kuypers. I'm not going to tell you more about it here because we don't have time, but that's just to illustrate how they thought about it. And then the second leg was organization, and that was the Broederbond, and they were studying the Broederbond. And when I talked to Ahmed Kathrada about the book, he confirmed what I was arguing, and he said when they got to Robben Island, all the others were reading Marx, but Mandela was reading Afrikaner nationalism. And it wasn't because he was a kindly old guy thinking he could get on with these guys. He was doing it because he knew you had to understand your enemy. So I mean, while we're on that, I mean, the last thing I'll say about that era is that, breaking apartheid was not easy. It took a hell of a strategy, and the strategy of the late 50s and early 60s and of Mandela and Sisulu and their generation was the strategy that worked in the 90s. That's not to say that there aren't people in the ANC who would like us to think that their role in 1976 was bigger than I think it was. I think black consciousness was more important in that period. The trade union movement, which was not what is now COSATU, did not come out of the ANC. So those factors need to be accommodated and given their due. But by the way, the other element that I think is should not be ignored is I got the only jail sentence for Muldergate, the South African Watergate that eventually brought down John Vorster. The relevant thing about that for me is this. Muldergate started because the apartheid government did two research studies on where the information was coming from for the United Nations Anti-Apartheid Committee, for the London-based anti-apartheid movement, for the ANC and so on. Where were they getting their material? And it turned out they were getting, the exact figures in the book, something like 80% was coming from one newspaper, the Rand Daily Mail, where I worked. And so for me, these are important elements we need to include when we try to understand what happened. And just now that I've mentioned the media, I want to read you one quote, and it's from somebody not necessarily very likable, but I think it's rather interesting because it does reveal something about how politics and the media do interrelate. And it's from Ken Flower, who was the head of Ian Smith's intelligence service. And what he says I found really fascinating, especially because it was coming from Smith's camp. He said that by 1972, Rhodesian Ian Smith government propaganda had long since prevailed over fact, and no one in authority was prepared to encourage disillusionment, or mention the possibility of defeat. Most of the white electorate by this time were unable to discriminate between fact and fancy, or were so confused as to have lost all powers of discrimination, and their leader, Ian Smith, appeared as one who had assumed a cloak of infallibility. Now, by the way, when Smith was forced out, and he wrote his book, what did he call it? Betrayed. And I thought that was fascinating. First of all, he lies to his own people. Then he believes his own lies, and as a result, he's able to say that he's been betrayed. That's actually what happened, and it does show the relationship between journalists and politicians. I think is kind of interesting. So I don't want to talk too long, but I do want to get to the post-1994 period. But before I do, let me say a couple of things about our early media, which... Okay, thanks. Just to go back to the early period, because the things I found, I uncovered, I felt cast an interesting light on the present. The first South African newspaper was started in 1800. That was under the British, because prior to that, the Cape Colony was governed by the Dutch East India Company. It was a company, not a government, so they obviously appeared not to have had any interest in having newspapers. So the first one was started in 1800. It was an exclusive license to be a printer and to print the only newspaper was awarded by a corrupt British governor named Sir George Yonge, Y-O-N-G-E, to a slave trading company, a substantial slave trading company in Cape Town. This governor was getting kickbacks from the slave trading company, so South Africa's media was truly conceived in sin. If we fast forward a little bit, by the 1820s was the first time that Pringle and Fairbairn started calling for press freedom, and I won't talk too much about that at this stage. But then the first black newspapers were already being started in the 1830s, as early as that in Xhosa. And those were started by missionaries, obviously, but soon they were being written by South Africans. And by the 1880s, those South Africans, black South Africans who were writing these newspapers, obviously didn't like the yoke of missionary control of their newspapers. They broke away and started their own. And the first one, of course, was Jabavu's. Now, the last thing I want to say about the 19th century, which again fits with my thread and why I think it tells you something useful, is because of Cecil Rhodes. Cecil Rhodes, I've established that at a minimum, he was secretly funding an English language newspaper, a Dutch newspaper, and a black newspaper, Jabavu's. At least one. Maybe there were probably many more because this was all secret, but I know at least those three. Now, he gave them press freedom until it counted. And it counted when, in the 1890s, he wanted war. He wanted the Anglo-Boer War to unite the country, to bring the four different territories together and all of that to become what became the Union of South Africa. He wanted war. And the interesting thing is, all three editors opposed him. The Dutch one, obviously, the English one as well, and Jabavu. They all feared the consequences of war for, good reason. And so what did Rhodes do? He pulled the money off all of them, off all three of them. And in the case of the English paper, this was already what became the big company that is now the Independent. It was the Cape Argus, the Star, and the Rhodesia Herald were already established by then. And Rhodes had enough shares in that company that he took control. He fired the editor, who was really the most brilliant journalist of that period, got rid of him because of his politics, and and hired more subservient editors who would go for war. So that was the English paper. The Dutch paper was more obvious because obviously they knew it would be fighting against their Dutch brethren in the north. And Jabavu also feared war because he obviously realized the consequences for ordinary people would be terrible. So much so that the British government banned his newspaper. They closed it down for the duration of the war. So that's the last thing I want to say about the 19th century, but I think it gives you an idea of why this thread tells a story that's bigger than journalism, and I think has some value for us. Now, I worked off the premise that the main political task from 1652 to 1994 was really to end racial oppression, political racial oppression, which ended with democracy in 1994. And after 1995, it seems to me the most strategically important issue is to provide jobs and economic transformation. And so the question is, how do we achieve that? And this is a debate that I think we're only in the beginning of having in a meaningful way. And one of the things I wanted to answer for myself was, I was in the Mandela government from 94 to 98. I was something called a councillor of the Independent Broadcasting Authority. And we were appointed in public hearings at Cadessa. So it was, in line with the, you should understand that broadcasting was the first thing to change in South Africa in 1994, for very obvious reasons. We knew, I'd covered the 1990 elections in Namibia. And I remember, I don't know if you were there, Chris, but I remember feeling it was so exciting because there were queues of people up and down hills and valleys waiting to vote, just like we had here later. People wanted the vote, they understood what it meant. But the journalism on television and on the radio was terrible. It was the same old Southwest Africa Broadcasting Corporation. And they were covering this election as if they were covering a foreign country. And many people felt, me included, but more important people than me, that in South Africa, it's pretty clear the ANC is going to win, but it's not just winning, it's the quality of the debate in the election, the quality of the campaign. And so the decision was taken that the SABC must change before 1994, and it did. And I ran the election coverage for the 23 radio stations in 94, and we felt pretty good about what we were able to achieve. But immediately after that, I became an IBA councillor, which is the equivalent of ICASA today. We were the broadcast regulator, and our job was to open the airwaves. Now, the question I wanted to answer for myself was this. In 1994, when we came to power, I felt this passion, that we had a sacred responsibility. After 300-something years of repression, we now had the opportunity to deliver services to deprived Black people who'd been oppressed all these years. And so we actually went out and we licensed 82 radio stations in the first year. And if you think there were only 25 when we started. So we licensed more news radio stations in a year than there'd been in the last 90 years. And then after that, we opened the commercial radio channels. All the radio stations you listen to here, with tiny exceptions, were licensed during my 4 years in office. And we created Black empowerment entities, or we set the regulatory regime, the state, we set a system that could create Black-dominated companies that would create real wealth and grow the cake. The cake I believed, I was quite certain the cake would get bigger. And we also set a minimum requirement for music, South African music on music stations. And that, at the time, you need to understand that South Africa's biggest music station, Radio 5, had less than 0.5% of its music was South African. And most of them, SABC stations, government stations, were almost no South African music. And they vigorously opposed us in many cases when we said, you're going to do 20% South African music. They said, you can't do it, it's not. Fortunately, we'd done really good research. We knew what we could do. We'd looked at other examples in other countries. By the way, Congo, for instance, where there's great music, and at least unless it's changed since I last looked, doesn't require this. So they play a lot of American music on Congolese stations. So we said, you can have American music if you want, 20% must be South African. And that has been a real factor in building the South African music industry. Fortunately, South Africans are not tone deaf like I am. If it was me, it wouldn't, I couldn't have done any good in the music department. But because South Africa has so much music, and we set the right ground rules, things grew that we'd never expected. Gospel has become much bigger than I could have imagined. Kwaito started when we licensed YFM and went all across Africa. So there were all these cultural benefits, but also job benefits. And these are good above ground jobs, and they're enriching in all sorts of ways. So we established what I would consider successful Black empowerment. These were companies predominantly Black. They were successful, they were growing the economy, they were creating real economic growth with all the ripple effects that has. And so, and of course, because we were the first in everything, we were also the first in corruption. So the first big scandal of the ANC era was in my organization, the Independent Broadcasting Authority. And I'd been a journalist covering corruption in Mouldergate and so on in the past, and now I was surrounded by this situation where the press were just baying at our heels and writing about the corruption. And I went to SCOPA, the Select Committee on Public Accounts, which you all know about, which is where you go with corruption cases in government, and I testified a whole day. It was incredibly dramatic. And in fact, funnily enough, it was in the old White Parliament chamber, you know that one, the green one. Now, all my years as a journalist, I was barred from Parliament because I was a security risk. So I'm finally allowed in, and then in the hot seat, but exposing corruption. And I got tremendous support from the ANC delegates there, MPs and so on. But after that, the government stepped in and basically protected the guilty and punished the innocent. And so I stayed my 4 years, and then I got out. And then the next thing I want to say before I sort of tie the ribbon around my question is broadcasting is one component of the information economy. If we get the information economy right, we all knew this in the 90s, by the way, this is not hindsight. If you get the information economy right, you create hundreds of thousands of good above ground jobs for Black South Africans. You do. And in fact, as far as I know, to this day, there's a great shortage of people in South Africa. Although there are all these jobs, there's so much unemployment, there are still thousands of jobs that can't be filled because we don't have enough people in the IT sector. So we said, now, information economy is made up of, it arose in the early 90s, late 80s, or whenever, because of the convergence of three things: broadcasting, telecommunications, and IT, computers. Now, in the past, the convergence was this, that in the past, you got your phone from a cable and you got your radio from the airwaves. It was in that period that changed. And as you all know now, it's all very obvious. You can get your phone from the airwaves, you can get your television from the cables. All of these things are intermingled. And of course, the computer is part of that. So that's what was going to create the information revolution. And information is the oil of the modern economy. So we said, this is where we've got to go. This is a major place for job creation, growth, and we should be able to do it as we did in broadcasting, that you create new Black companies, they become active, they use skills that they may not have, but it's Black control, Black management, and you set up programs that will going to develop all of that. And that didn't happen. So I have a chapter which is called Why South Africa Missed the Information Revolution. And for me, that became central to understanding the thesis I'm now working on, which is around the question of state building. And when you think of it, Mandela's job was nation building, and Mbeki's job was state building. And so the question is, what went wrong? And so in my chapter, I'm quite hard on Mbeki, because what actually happened, although I then want to go deeper into the theory just a little bit before I stop and take questions. What happened was, I remember in the 90s, British Telecom, Deutsche Telekom, the Dutch, all these big first-tier telecom companies came here. It was the early days of the dot-com boom. They came with billions. They were prepared to invest billions. But a couple of things happened. There were a couple of examples of political interference with the regulator, which wasn't my regulator. The details of who it was don't matter, but it's all in the book. President Mbeki got his lawyer to go to expressly interfere, and then his minister, Ivy Motsepe-Kasaburi, came out to the regulator and interfered in a very sensitive judicial process. And after that, all those telecom companies left. Because once there was going to be political interference, they were not prepared to be involved. Because, telecoms is a bit like mining. You invest billions and billions in the beginning, and you only get paid out long after. You have to build an entire national network of base stations and so on, and start selling before you get your profit. So you need to have security of what the state is going to be like. Is the state going to act professionally and independently or not? It can set whatever rules, but will the rules stick? Or will they change when there's political interference? And so that's what I want to understand. And so I think I've made some progress in it, and we can talk more about that. But the last thing I will say is I've been reading some of the theorists about state building, and I'll defer to the great theorists at this table very quickly. But one of the things that I'm discovering that's interesting is some of these guys say that the key to this is the professionalization of the state. And they look at countries where this happened and where it didn't happen. And they say that it happened first in places like Prussia because of war. And it happened relatively early in Britain, also before there was any true democracy. It was during the 1800s, there was the Reform Bill and so on, but in fact, they were still very far from universal, even male suffrage. And the argument of some of the theorists, at least, is that it happened much more slowly in America because democracy came first. Because when democracy starts in any new country, whether it's South Africa or Greece or Italy, which are bad cases too, if democracy comes first, the normal process is that politicians get elected and use use the voters to provide patronage, and the patronage becomes what they call clientelism, which is a sort of more advanced form of patronage. That votes are given are demanded in return for favors and to build a system which is not based on merit and is not totally professional. And so the question then is, where are we on that spectrum? And we're a kind of hybrid. We're a kind of state of a special type, you could say, because we had a state, the white state existed. It was built on patronage and clientelism. And as that leadership got to the point where they wanted a professional states and bureaucracy, they left, and the ANC came in, and it started, had this hybrid situation of what existed and what it created. And that's, for me, an important question about how we're going to go to the next phase. And it hooks directly to the example I use of the information economy, but you can apply it to others, because I think we would agree that while we have some ministries that work, that are very professional, we have a very good health minister, treasury, things like that. We have others that are poor. I mean, obviously our education results in the maths and science are getting worse, not better, when we're spending the money. So what's behind that? And in the area of information, this is the last thing I'll say, then I promise to stop, is Thabo Mbeki kept one minister in power for 10 years as communications minister. And I interviewed Alan Hirsch, who was Thabo Mbeki's chief economist. And I said, did you have these figures? And I held up the figures to show how we were failing. And he said, yes. I said, did you show them to the president? He said, yes, I briefed him fully. I said, why did we not benefit from the information revolution? And he said, really, I don't know. He had really no answers. But he left the minister in charge for 10 years. Now Zuma comes in, and Zuma's strategy is the opposite. It's a very common strategy, of course, for leaders like himself, which is he's changed the minister every single year. So there's never a minister who knows what they're doing. So I would argue that Mbeki demanded insufficient accountability over 10 years. Zuma actually almost doesn't care about accountability. He changes the person every year. And actually, if you know this sector as some of us do, it's fairly clear why he keeps changing ministers, but it doesn't have to do with making them efficient. And in a ministry like this, it's so complex. If you keep changing ministers every year, you can be sure our information economy ratings in the world are not going to go up. They're going to continue to go down. So that's what I hope is a useful start to a discussion today.
Thank you. Thank you, John. I'm not going to be so foolish as to try and sum up either the narrative or the storyline just shared by John. What I must say, though, I mean, I find the book fascinating in a number of respects. First of all, you know, David, the historiography of the book, taking us through almost 150 years, if you like, and the importance of information, broadcasting, but the intersection between the media and politics. And if I could just single out one of the narratives, powerful narratives that are running through the book for me, it is the intersection between ideology and, as you put it, organizational politics. I was fascinated in your analysis of Foster, and for example, what he tried to do and how he tried to refine and adapt and change Verwoerd's ideology in order to achieve his goals. But your ultimate prognosis, though, that we failed post-94 in the information technological revolution, or on the score of information revolution. I mean, it's of course a dire one. It's a dire one. And I was going to ask you the question, but I think you've answered it in part. Why is Mbeki playing such a prominent role in this book? Because he almost sticks out in the post-94 period. And just on that score, one final point, then I hand over to David Moore. It's not just your intersection between ideology and organization that for me is so powerful, but at times you almost delve into the leadership styles of prominent actors that you delve into, and I dare say including the arch himself, Tutu. But it's how you almost unpack for us Mandela, Mbeki, Foster, Verwoerd, and others. So thanks again for that, Dave Matisson. David Moore, over to you, and thanks again for allowing yourself to be ambushed.
Thank you, Chris. You're good at ambushing. So I got this book for Christmas, and since Christmas I got up to reading about up to 1974, when the coup in Portugal changed the whole geopolitical environment in this part of the world drastically. And I think that's the time when Raymond Lowe became the editor of the Rand Daily Mail. So I stopped there. Then this morning, because other things sort of happen, and I made sure that Chris was going to be the chair, so that because I knew I wouldn't have time to finish the whole book. Anyway, so now I'm the discussant. So I phoned John up at about 12 o'clock today and said, when I found out I'd be there, he said, what chapter should I read? So he said, read chapter 22. That's on the Mbeki brothers, and chapter 26 on the information revolution and where it went wrong. And I think I read chapter 28 as well. So taking some themes from those chapters, but your way of bringing history into contemporary politics is amazing. I mean, you look at the intellectual development of these waves of nationalists, and fascinating the way the media plays a big role. So you kind of have the Cold War. Before that, the nationalism of the Mandelas and black consciousness, the Cold War, a bit of communism comes in. You don't mention that magic word liberalism, which is maybe a sort of F word in South Africa these days. But I would like to kind of know where you situate yourself in these. Oh, I should speak up. All right, where is this thing? There we are. I'd like to know how you situate yourself in this ideological perspective. Where, as a student and a student leader, you saw the role of young intellectuals, white intellectuals. Maybe you changed at some, some points during this long historical period of apartheid, and where you might stand now. Because I think you might be a liberal. I don't know. You talk about state building, and you come up with sort of the mess we're in, and you segue off Moletsi and Becky's discussions of BEE, and you use that term that Moletsi and Becky grabbed from the Chinese, the comprador bourgeoisie. So there's a fairly kind of Marxist or Maoist Marxist notion there. Is it this comprador bourgeoisie which has infiltrated the state and got all these plum jobs, all this corruption, the political interference, jobs for the boys and girls, and so on? Is this kind of class which is taking power here? Because at the end of the book you say, look, you take off from Moletsi and Becky and talking about the resource curse. So societies like South Africa, ranging from Canada to Nigeria to places with a lot of mineral resources, end up relying too much on them, and they figure they don't have to be innovative, and then get into this high-tech stuff that you're into. So you have the resource curse. This feeds in to the patron-client relationships, using the state as the source of wealth. So at the end, you have kind of a prognosis for the future, which is, I think, 427, 428. Here it is. So the world has entered a period of low commodity prices. The last commodity bear market devastated Africa, made worse by nationalization of failing businesses. The Zuma administration is flirting with similar errors. The public, that's a pretty amorphous concept, John. The public, the media, unions, business, the professions, the constitutional institutions, and yes, the middle class will have to pull it back. But if we're talking about social forces here, class forces, fractions, intellectuals, middle class, who is the middle class? The middle class is a dream. The World Bank now says the middle class is anybody earning more than $2 a day, It's a pretty amorphous sort of concept. So who are we pulling it back from if we are these people who want to pull it back? So I want you to get in a little bit of class analysis there. And you say at another point that the force on the horizon, which was in the news on Saturday with their local manifesto, isn't going to be much different. Where are we here? I should have used that place for my notes. Where are we? There's nothing to indicate Malema's party will not be a younger and smarter version of the same. So you talked a little bit about this in your last remarks, and you also talk about your readings on state building, and you get into our hero or demon Francis Fukuyama, whose book Political Order and Decay is a direct descendant of Samuel Huntington's. Now, Samuel Huntington was the guy who, when he was advisor to the Secretary of State, said, let's bomb Vietnam into modernization. But his thesis was too much participation too early spells trouble, which is what you just said Fukuyama is saying. Now, if you're wedded to the media, you're wedded to freedom of the media, the Fifth Estate, which is the democratic bastion. And you're kind of saying with these guys, well, at some points, maybe if we're going to have an effective developmental state, which is another word that everybody uses these days, you might want to comment on that. There has to be a little bit of soft authoritarianism. Maybe Rhodes has to, stop the press. Or, so this is a contradiction here, and I think it is a contradiction in the literature that we read all the time. Democracy, authoritarianism, developmental state. Look at the states which have developed quickly. Stalin, China. Anyway, so there's a little bit of the stuff about your economics, political interference, patron-client relations, learning from Mugabe. You even say at one time, South Africa might be learning from Mugabe. More and more institutions sending their cadres to be trained in China and so on. You do have a chapter in Zimbabwe, which I read a long time ago, and I think you rely a lot on Frank Chikani's book. But there's just a fascinating document that Thabo Mbeki published with to the ANC in 2001, just before the 2002 elections. And he's saying, you've got to follow the IMF, whether you like them or not. You've got to do what the World Bank wants to do. You've got to make a deal with white capital, including farmers. He's smashing Mugabe here. He's saying, if you have to make an alliance with the lumpen proletariat, you're in deep trouble. So he goes and says what Mugabe did wrong in the 80s, and he says, to get out of it, you got to have free and fair elections in 2002. Well, we know what happened after, many years. So you might want to, how much has South Africa learned from Mugabe in the bad sense? You might want to sort of comment on that a bit. And back to these, I think to the consistent prevailing issues, which you start off with so well, studying the ideology and the organization of the ruling party at the time, getting inside the heads of the enemy, and religion. Now, if you were to look at the relationship between religion now and this regime, what would you say? The evangelicals, which again is quite an interesting situation in Zimbabwe. But if we're going to look at that relationship between religion, ideology, and politics, where would you say we're going now? And I think religion is also Ponzi schemes and pyramid schemes. And at the organization, okay, I think the reason you probably discuss Mbeki a lot is because he had 2 full terms. You probably worship Mandela a little bit too much. And you don't know where we're going to end with the current regime, although you're sort of indicating that it's getting pretty bad. So where do you see this organization, which started up, way back 1912, and all of these interesting currents at different conjunctures in history, and they were held together by people like Mandela, Tambo, and Mbeki for a while. What's going to happen to it now? A little bit, media, you're still kind of a journalist, and you're always gazing into the future. You're analyzing the present and the past in terms of what you think is going to happen in the future, which of course we do as political scientists. We're kind of a step. There's historians, there's political scientists, and the journalists, right? We're somewhere in between. So I think that's about my take on the 6 or 7 chapters I've read of this book, which I really do want to stop teaching courses and read the rest of it. So thank you so much for bringing this book to us and talking today. The format now is you respond to Chris and I, right, for a little while, and then you take over and take questions from the floor. Anyway, we return it to the chair.
Thanks. I'm going to break with that tradition, Dave. First of all, thank you to you, and I think you did an excellent job for somebody who was ambushed less than 6 hours ago. So consider yourself ambushed for future purposes as well. So John, before you respond though, why don't I open up, take at least 3 questions, from our participants, just to open it up, and then please respond to David as well. I should have introduced Professor Moore and say that for those of you who don't know him, he is the head of Department of Development Studies here at UJ, and I certainly regard him, and I'm not saying it because he's sitting here, but I certainly regard him as one of the foremost political economists doing work on the global political economy and Africa's place in it, and as well as his works on Zimbabwe. In fact, he's a student of Zimbabwe, having done his postgraduate work on Zimbabwe, and has followed Zimbabwean politics in his various iterations for very many years, if not decades. So Dave, thanks to you as well. So I'm going to take 3 inputs from the floor to start off with, and then I'll get John Matisson to respond again. Who wants to go first? Please do not be shy. And if you are going to be shy, I'm going to identify you and assume you wanted to ask a question. So I see Nabila over there. Yeah, Nabila wants to ask a question. Can I get 2 more hands, please, for now? Same table, yes, sir. And another one. From the same table, it's fine. It's okay. if the middle table wants to dominate things, the center wants to dominate that, that's okay. Okay, I'll go with those two for now. Briefly introduce yourself and then make your comment, and you are allowed